All right, moving down into the trachea. The trachea is basically the long tube that carries air. So it's going to extend downward, anterior in front of the esophagus, into your thoracic cavity where it's going to split into a right bronchus and a left bronchus, and bronchi is the plural term. So you have right and left bronchi. The inner wall of the trachea lined with ciliated mucous membrane, just like that picture that we looked at earlier. Lots of goblet cells that are going to produce mucus that will trap incoming particles. The tracheal wall typically has 20, if you actually count, there's 20 incomplete rings that keep that airway open. So when we dissected the cat, that trachea is much more rigid. It doesn't collapse and get flat like your esophagus. Those cartilage rings are what keep that airway open. You don't want your airway to collapse. So if I look, here's the cartilage rings that we were talking about. So the trachea comes down. Remember, this is backwards, so this will be the right side. Right main bronchus, left main bronchus, and then they are going to continue to branch like a tree. So off of this is going to be a superior branch, inferior branch, middle branch, and then those branches are going to branch off into smaller and smaller branches on each side. Review of your pleural cavities, our pleura. Visceral, remember, lines the organs, so visceral is going to line the lungs. Parietal is going to be the outside, and then the cavity is going to be in between those. So when I put all of that together, we call it the bronchial tree. So the bronchial tree consists of those branches of tubes that lead from the trachea to the small little pockets called alveoli. So when we actually talk the bronchial tree, it starts with the two main bronchi, primary bronchi that lead to each lung. Next are the lobar, the secondary, often called secondary bronchi, going into each lobe, and then they're going to branch into tertiary bronchi into each of the lobes. So typically I say primary, secondary, tertiary are the terms that I commonly use for those. The segmented or tertiary bronchi further subdivide terminal, meaning ending bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and then they're going to end in the individual alveoli. Inside these alveoli, there's very, very thin single-layer epithelial cells, and that's where the gas exchange between the blood and your lungs take place. So gas exchange in the lungs occurs at the alveoli. So here, if I break it down, we've looked at, so here's the bronchial trees, here's your primary. As you get down, you can see these tertiary branches are going to be even further down. A terminal bronchiole, we're getting smaller. Eventually, you have an alveolar duct that leads to an individual alveoli. And then that alveoli is where the gas exchange actually takes place. And in birds, when we talk about respiration, birds have even more alveoli than we do because of their flight. They need a tremendous amount of gas exchange. So here again, kind of looking at the smaller view. Starting with, we'll look at a terminal bronchiole. So basically we're just branching smaller and smaller. Terminal bronchiole, respiratory bronchiole. Here would be an alveolar duct. And then as your alveolar duct comes in, the alveolar sac is like the cavity or the empty space inside of these alveoli that are at the ends of each. So if you've ever eaten a pomegranate, the inside little seeds of a pomegranate, that's almost the shape that these little alveoli would have. That's kind of what they remind me of. You have a right and left lung. They are soft, they are spongy. If you get to go to cadavers ever, if you've dissected animals, they're like a sponge. They're very soft. They're separated medially by the mediastinum, and they're enclosed by your diaphragm and thoracic cage. The primary bronchi and large blood vessels enter each lung there at that medial surface. A layer of serous membrane, the visceral pleura, is attached to the lung, and then the parietal pleura, like I said, is on the outside, and then that pleural cavity in between has that serous fluid that helps to prevent friction and things like that. When people get fluid on their lungs or their lungs have fluid, a lot of time it will fill that. It'll be located in that cavity is where there will be excess fluid, and that causes a weight or heaviness on your lungs. So here, if we're taking a section cut right here, basically all this is going to show, here's your heart. So mediastinum is this middle part. I have my right lung, I have my left lung, and then like I said, visceral lines the lungs, parietals on the outside, and then the cavities in the middle. Your right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior. Your left only has 2 lobes. Any guesses why? What sits a little to the left side? Your heart. So in order to accommodate your heart, your left lung is a little bit smaller in size than your right lung. Each lobe contains air passages. Each lobe has its own alveoli, nerves, blood vessels. Obviously, each lobe, you could live with one functioning lung. A lot of people will have a collapsed lung, and it's very noticeable. You would not be able to do much vigorous, you would be able to do no vigorous activity if you only had one functioning lung. So here, tables in your book, tables in your notes, gives you a description and the function of each part of your respiratory system. So that would be a good table to look at before your test. And that's where we'll stop for today.